Do come on down. We feel quite lonely down here. Well, I've retired, and I don't go into the department that much. I was lecturing on the natural sciences program until 18 months ago, after retirement. But they've now upskilled the teaching team. And then George Littlejohn, learning that I wasn't teaching, said, "Can you come down and teach for me?" So this academic year, I've done 2 courses in Plymouth.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, I love both Exeter and Plymouth. They're great places.
Very different cities. Okay, well, I can just about see people scattered about. I'm sure we could do some very interesting ecological studies about where people have chosen to position themselves. So you know what's happening here, about a year ago, Chris Willmott, who you'll meet in a few minutes, and I were asked to organize some sessions on bioethics. And this is one of them, but the sessions haven't been branded in the way we expected. So what you are about to hear is 3 very short talks, and then an open panel discussion, which will stop as the wine starts to flow, about why understanding ethics in our subject actually increases the impact of our science, whether we're a science student or whether we're a science practitioner. My name is John Bryant. I'm Professor Emeritus of Molecular Biology at Exeter, and also ran all their bioethics programs, and I'm a past president of the Society, so it's a pleasure to be able to run a session here this afternoon. And it's a pleasure also to introduce to you Dr. Lynne Sneddon from, or is it Professor these days, Lynne? From the University of Liverpool to kick us off with a discussion of, and the title should be coming up.
Thanks very much to Chris and to John for inviting me here to talk about how incorporating ethics into your science can increase the impact. And I'm going to specifically talk about some work I've been doing for many years, which is to improve welfare in laboratory fish. Well, I am an animal welfare scientist. I believe we have the right to use animals, but we should do so humanely. We obviously use animals in experiments. We don't get their permission, they don't volunteer, and we assume they have no concept of what's going to happen to them. So it's particularly important to have a set of principles that one can apply to govern the way that we use animals in research to make sure we're doing it ethically. And of course, we need to have knowledge of what those ethical principles are. And I refer you to the 3 R's. These were developed by Russell and Birch, and we typically apply these to research using animals. And we can ask a number of key questions. Can we replace the animals? Do we have to use a whole animal for experiment? Can we use tissues or cells instead? Can we use a reductive approach where we calculate the right sample size, the minimum effective sample size, to test a hypothesis? Are we using the most refined techniques? Are we monitoring welfare, and we're using the least invasive techniques? Now, when I'm talking about protected animals, for the time being, I remain in Europe, and the legislation governing the use of animals in science is very strict, and of course the UK adopt these legislation. And a protected animal, for those of you who are not familiar with this, is an adult cephalopod or an adult vertebrate. Those that are not covered by the law are immature forms of these animals or other species of invertebrates. So, for example, zebrafish are not covered until they've reached the point at which it's 5 days post-fertilization, because they're not actually independently feeding at that point. Of course, much of the science that we've heard about today and that we'll hear about in the coming days uses whole animals. We are interested in comparative animal biology, so we have to use whole animals. And myself and some colleagues, Lewis Halsey and Nick Burry, basically wrote a commentary on how to apply the 3Rs principles within the sphere of experimental animal biology. And very, very briefly, we suggested that for ethical animal experimentation, we use guidelines such as the PREPARE guidelines, the NC3R's Experimental Design Assistant. And first off, we have to justify that study. The benefits of this study must outweigh the cost to the animals. That's key. Otherwise, we shouldn't use animals. We first ask, can we replace them? Can we use cells, tissues, human volunteers, meta-analysis? If the answer is no, we must use a whole animal, then reduction and refinement become more important. And so we must use reduction where we calculate the minimum sample size. That does not necessarily have to be a low sample size, but many grant funding bodies are asking for your power calculations, how you derived your sample sizes. And refinement, are you using the least invasive techniques? Are you ensuring the welfare of the animals during the experiments? And finally, once you've done your experiments, are you actually publishing that work, even if the results are negative? And to be ethical, you should do so. And many journals are adopting the ARRIVE guidelines. There is a set of guidelines about full reporting of methods to improve reproducibility between labs. I'm going to focus on refinement because much of my research has looked at this question of refinement and specifically about monitoring welfare during experiments, and if we use invasive techniques which cause tissue damage, this might give rise to pain. And so we should look at minimizing that by having pain relief or analgesic protocols in place. So I focused on refining experiments using fish because they're used in an increasingly wide range of contexts. They're a very popular model for experiments. So for example, in the UK, they are the second most popular model. We use 500,000 fish each year in experiments. And these kind of numbers are likely to reflect global use of fish. Many biomedical researchers are turning to zebrafish as a model species for their work. Why would we safeguard welfare? Well, I believe it's a no-brainer. If you want to have valid, reliable, robust results, you need to use healthy individuals. So we need to have a means of monitoring welfare for animals. And of course, we all want to have good science at the end of the day. Compared with mammals, there's currently no tools that we can use to automatically assess fish welfare. And so it would be a very important refinement to our current protocols to develop a tool to accurately and reliably assess welfare in fish. Another issue, of course, is that pain in animals, if you accept that any tissue-damaging procedures, tagging, surgery, causes injury to the animal, which may give rise to pain. And it may be that in your experiments, you're actually measuring the responses to pain rather than the treatment that you're interested in. So it could confound your experiments. And so if pain is not the objective, it would be important to try and minimize that and develop pain relief protocols. So I'm going to talk about a project that was funded by the National Centre for 3Rs in the UK, looking at zebrafish. And we set out to develop an intelligent monitoring software tool that could monitor the health and welfare of zebrafish. And further, we wanted to develop analgesic or pain relief protocols in these species. So what we did is we developed a tracking tool where we could monitor the behavior of the fish. Here you can see the top view of the tank, and you see there's a little tracking dot on the fish. This is in 3D, it also works in 2D, but we get real-time behavioral data acquisition, things like speed, tank use. And the normal, healthy behavior of zebrafish is for them to be continuously swimming, using the entire area of the tank. This is a pair here of control fish. You can see they're interacting with one another and swimming around. However, one of these pair has received a fin clip under anesthesia where part of the tail fin is removed, and this is done for genomic screening. However, pain relief is not typically applied, and what you can see is that this fish that's had the fin clip moves very little and is just sitting on the bottom of the tank. So it's quite a profound change in behavior. We can also track the behavior of groups of fish, and this allows us to see what the fish are up to, and we can use that then as a means of assessing welfare. And this just shows you that we can track individuals within that scope. So here's some examples of what you can find. This is an individual zebrafish. We've got control fish, and this is their tank use. The green dots are slow swimming, red dots fast swimming. This is a sham-handled fish, which has been anesthetized, but nothing's been done to it. Then we have the fin clip fish, which has been anesthetized and had a fin clip. One which has had a pit tag inserted into the abdomen through an incision. One which has had surgery, so muscle damage, and one which has been exposed to a noxious chemical. And you can see quite clearly that the behavior is substantially changed from the control fish. We can then further test the efficacy of a different range of drugs with pain-relieving properties. So, for example, we've got lidocaine here at 5 mg per litre, and we decided to go for immersion analgesia rather than injecting the animal, because these are tiny fish, they're only around 1 gram, and to actually inject them is actually quite damaging. So we've actually just dissolved these drugs in the water, and what we want to see is normal tank use. And you can see you get that with lidocaine, that's a local anesthetic. Bupivacaine, another local anesthetic, not quite so successful. Flunixin at a low dose, not successful, but flunixin at 8 mg per litre is. Morphine at a low dose, not successful, but at high dose it is. And so that data can be used to refine our current protocols in terms of providing pain relief. And we've developed this tool called the Fish Behavior Index, and we just published it about 2 weeks ago. And basically that allows you to quantify the behavior of the zebrafish, and it gauges how the animal is behaving, and then gives you an actual alert whether the animal is healthy, okay, unhealthy, or abnormal, and that will allow carers to intervene. And you can download that from our website, so it's free. I'm an idealist, so I hope that zebrafish labs across the world will download this, start using it, and help to refine their protocols. But it might also be useful for other species where the behavior is similar. Now, I think to be ethical, one has to engage the public and be open and transparent about the kind of science that we do. But many of us are publicly funded, and SEB is actually signed up to the Understanding Animal Research Concordat on openness in animal research. And there are a number of ways you can do this, and this obviously enhances your impact, really, in the public domain. So many scientists are using social media. So here's me on Twitter. I promote my own field. So here I am self-promoting my own work, So talking about whether fish experience pain. But I also promote other scientists' work. Here we have Sandra Binning and her work showing that fish are intelligent, but they're more intelligent if they're parasite-free. Here we have some manta rays that, when given mirrors, blow bubbles at themselves and wave at themselves. So it shows that they recognize themselves in mirrors. So it shows that the fish are intelligent, sentient beings, I would argue. I get asked to do all sorts of wacky things, and I think it's important to engage with the media. I've thrown in a couple of examples that might make you chuckle. This is a goldfish called Dick, and he lost the ability to maintain equilibrium, but his buoyancy had gone. So his owner made a sling, and I was asked whether this was kind or not. And I increasingly get asked about the welfare of crustaceans, in particular lobsters has come on the agenda. So there was a restaurant in Maine which were basically smoking their lobsters with cannabis before boiling them, and they felt that was really humane because it meant the animals didn't feel pain when they were boiled alive. And this last one is the last media story I've done, which was published last month in an ornamental fish-keeping magazine. And in effect, I feel my role as a scientist is to provide the data and then let people make up their minds. And here the magazine ran a poll, do you think fish can feel pain? And 96% of 460 people said yes. So, just to thank the funding bodies, people were named on the publications, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Lynne, for that very clear presentation. There'll be a chance to question all the speakers in a few minutes. My pleasure now to introduce to you Chris Willmott from the University of Leicester, with whom I've done a lot of work on bioethics in the UK and elsewhere. Chris.
Thank you. Will the slides come up automatically?
The slides will come up, yeah.
Magic like magic. Splendid. Lovely. Thank you, John. So John just asked us by way of introduction to say a little bit about our involvement in these areas of the ethical issues of science. And so, as we're aware, I think bioethics is an interdisciplinary subject. It sits and interacts with a number of different subjects: medicine, philosophy, law, sociology, media studies, and so on. But for most of us at the present conference, it's in the area of biology that we're going to see the biggest interaction. And so my context is teaching at the University of Leicester in the UK, so right there in the middle of the country. The majority of our bioethics teaching is to second-year undergraduates. There are about 320 students in that year group, and we have a module called Research Topic, which looks at research experimental design, but also aspects of career, of statistical analysis, those kind of things. And included amongst that is the bioethics. Now, the way in which we deliver that teaching has evolved in the recent past. We used to have 4 lecture sessions to begin with. That's become 1 introductory lecture, and then the 3 out of the 4 lectures which were delivered face-to-face have become flipped teaching instead. So the students have recorded versions of some of that material, and they're expected to have engaged with that. And then we use the 3 remaining face-to-face sessions for discussing case studies. Now, I'm not going to say any more about that at the moment, but if anybody wants to ask any questions about the use of case studies or flipped teaching approaches, then please do so in the Q&A. Out of that 320, about 50 take a further module on applications of medical biochemistry, and they actually produce videos about bioethics topics as part of that task. And again, I'm happy to answer questions about that. I do teach the medical students. There's a module on science, society, and responsible research, which is taken by master's level, intercalated master's level medical students. And they've got quite a lot of background in clinical ethics, but it's increasingly recognized that medics are going to do some research at some stage. And so we now introduced an element of research ethics for them as well. In terms of a broader context, John's mentioned that we've worked together in a special interest group on teaching ethics to bioscience students. We've been doing that since 2002, which is the point at which some UK guidance on the teaching of ethics to scientists was introduced, and I'll come back to that in a moment. I also served 2 terms on the Education Committee for the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, and involved in various presentations and writing projects. Those have included, and I mention this because partly the context we are at the moment, so this book has Catalan and Spanish versions, and a couple have just come from a session where the public engagement with science was being mentioned, and what is it that influences public understanding of the various developments, these controversial, newsworthy developments. How do they understand the background to that? And that's one of the things which this book was hoping to address. So in the UK context, there is this legislation, well, guidance really, rather than full-blown legislation, which started in 2002 and was developed by the QAA, which is the Quality Assurance Agency. As you can see on the slide there, their brief is to safeguard standards and improve the quality of UK higher education wherever in the world that's delivered. And in all 3 versions of the documents that have come out, so they've been through 3 different issues, 3 different editions now, and in all 3 versions, the impact of science on society is writ large within those. So, for example, these are not exhaustive, but just by illustration, the document says that students should expect to be confronted by some of the scientific, moral, and ethical questions raised by their study subject, to consider viewpoints other than their own, and to engage in critical assessment and intellectual argument. That's been expanded in the most recent version to include this notion of dealing with uncertainty. And I think that's something when we think about the impact of science, which people are uncomfortable with that notion. They tend to think that science gives black and white arguments. So we've got to start that understanding of the fact that actually there are different shades of grey within science with our own students. That students should recognise that there are moral and ethical issues associated with carrying out investigations and the importance of professional codes of conduct. That all students should appreciate the ethical issues and professional integrity, and that a typical student should be able to give reasoned arguments, explain why that's the position that they and others might want to adopt. In terms of the ethical issues, just a couple of slides here to outline some of the things which crop up naturally. You'll be aware of more topics than this, I'm sure, but we're thinking here about issues of research integrity, of biomedical ethics, and of environmental ethics. In terms of research integrity, the way in which experiments are being conducted, the fact that we've got large budgets involved in a lot of this research, notions of the honesty and integrity of the work. I include on the list there sabotage. We're seeing increasing examples where one postdoc sabotages the work of another. That's been an uncomfortable recent trend. And then the dual-use dilemma, the notion that science that's produced for good could be used in harmful ways as well. Biomedical ethics, again, I'm not going to read through this list exhaustively, but we covered different aspects of genetic and the application of genetics, recent developments in neuroscience, and then issues to do with drug development and drug trials, both within the own country of the researchers, but also then taking advantage, and often it is advantage, with vulnerable groups elsewhere. And then environmental bioethics, again, some of the things which are going to be much closer to the areas of research for many of you than they are for me. Okay, so that's it in terms of my introduction. As I say, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions to us all in a moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And then finally, before our panellists are exposed to questions, a great pleasure again to introduce Ros Gleadow to you from Melbourne, Australia.
Thanks, John, and thanks everyone for being here. It's always a challenge to be between a scientist and a free drink. So I could have the slides, please. Yes? Slides? Here we go. So I'm a plant scientist. One of the things I'm here with is, in fact, the Global Plant Council. You'll find us out on table 1 near the babysitting. I'm going to talk to you now just a little bit about what we do about teaching bioethics at my university, Monash University, and it's really teaching bioethics to students who don't think it's relevant to them and they shouldn't have to learn it, and it's a compulsory course that they have to do. And basically the strategy is grab their attention, make it relevant to their lives, and really instill in them that the codes of conduct are in fact very important. So this is the slide I start with, and this illustrates all the points that we cover in bioethics. We have animal testing, which we've already looked at. We look at humans in experimentation, which is what I'm going to talk to you about today. We look at aspects of peer review, and we look at fraud and so on, which were topics that Chris covered. So basically the topics are very similar. Just for the context, it's a compulsory interdisciplinary second-year subject called Scientific Practice on Communication, and really interdisciplinary. Like, this has physicists and mathematicians and computer scientists in it, so you can see why they think they don't need to know about it. And the course is really about understanding what science is, how it works, how to do communication, assess information, and then analysis of ethical issues, and applying these to current issues. And it's quite interesting talking to ethical issues about some of these students, because some of them have never really even thought that many of the things that they're involved with or related to were in fact ethical issues. They just think ethics is animal ethics or human experimentation. But we know that the topics are much broader than that. And that's really what I'm trying to do, is to just get them engaged in the subject. We have until recently had traditional lectures on a number of different topics, and then they do the workshops, which are in these little interactively designed rooms where they sit around tables and work through various ethical dilemmas that we have. So if you want to read more about that, I've written up this and a couple of feedback for some early SEB education sessions that I was involved with. So this is one of the topics we get them to start with. Do you have this TV show here where people get married on TV when they've never met before? And they basically then, so they've been matched. So the idea is that they would in fact have a successful relationship. I'm not sure whether that works. And then they put them in all these kinds of really stressful relationships to try and undo that. Well, basically there's been 5 seasons in Australia and there's only one marriage still in existence. And I think I read last week that they'd just broken up. So it doesn't work. And so what they do is they often talk about it being a social experiment and so on. But there was an interesting article in The Conversation recently where it actually just said that this is not real science, and no research ethics committee would ever provide approval for such an experiment to go ahead. And so this topic is quite interesting because because it's on television, somehow you can get away with it. And secondly, it's something that the students can connect with, because apparently lots of people watch this show. I've never actually ever watched it. So really the factors in ethical biomedical research are, human rights and humanity, ethical design of research, and then scientific competence. And all these things have to be present to have ethical research. But the question is, how have we come at this? So how has this awareness grown? So we do some things on animal ethics and how our ideas about animals and whether they can feel or not, or have intellectual capacity or not, changes. But this is to do with humans. Really, one of the big contexts for this is, in fact, the Nuremberg Trials, the Nazi doctors that were convicted of crimes against humanity. And some of these doctors pleaded in their defence that these horrible things that they did to people were not against any international law, and therefore they should not be prosecuted. Well, thank goodness the judge didn't agree. But really the result of that was that the Nuremberg Code was drawn up, and there did become international law that made it illegal to treat people like that. And that's really the origin of the formalising of what we now regard as humans in experimentation. It wasn't formalised before that. And so we go through these various topics. I won't go through in detail, but there's things like they need to be voluntary, there has to be fruitful results, they have to be important, they can't just do frivolous experiments, it has to be done by qualified people, and that you can opt out at any time during the experiment. Now this has been developed up further, and those of you, I don't know how many people here do human research, so you might be like my students, you think this is not relevant to you. Okay, so the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964, it really addresses these issues and comes out of this. And this is updated quite regularly. In fact, I think it was updated about 2 years ago. The World Medical Association has this, and all experiments are consistent with this code. And if they're not, you won't get your research published. But apparently you can put it in a TV show. Another example I take were the Nigerian drug trials unethical? I don't know if you ever saw the film The Constant Gardener, but that's really related to this trial that happened. There was a meningitis epidemic in Nigeria, and there were various international aid agencies delivering drugs, and Pfizer set up a tent next to all the humanitarian agencies and were inoculating people with their existing drug and a new experimental drug. They didn't ask for informed consent, and there was apparently a small increase in deaths of people or damage from people who took this. So this is an ongoing thing. If you want to Google it, and I do this every year when I give the lectures, I just get the latest update because it's quite a harrowing suggestion. So by the time I cover something that's TV-oriented, the origins of these things, and then something human like this does relate to many of the students. But the thing that really gets them in is discussion of, this is a page I took from the student side, is the Facebook's emotional experiment. Now, how many people here are on Facebook? Come on, lots of you will have a Facebook account even if you never look at it. So you were probably online long enough ago for this to happen. In 2012, Facebook altered the algorithms in an experiment so that in one they gave you more feeds, gave you more positive content in your feeds, and other people, randomly selected, 500,000 people around the world, were given negative content in their feeds, and then they analysed the posts that you did after that to see if your posts were more likely to be negative or positive. It's true, if you read negative stuff, you were more likely to say you were unhappy or had less positive emotions. And then they published this in PNAS. Now, we had no idea that that was happening. They never asked us if we could be part of that experiment. And in one of those many, many reams of information that says, I agree to this, we actually tick a thing that says that Facebook can do whatever they like with what we post if it's using it to improve the user experience or something like that. So they got away with it. And I guess for me, I found this quite shocking, and until recently all the students found this quite shocking. And this year the students went, yeah, of course, Facebook would always do something like that. So I guess that's also that you need to keep updating your examples when you're teaching, always. We know this, you've got to keep them current. So just to sum up what I've said, how to make bioethics relevant to non-biomed students or even non-plant science students. First of all, this session ranks really high in the student evaluations. We get them round tables and they discuss various ethical issues, not these ones, but other scenarios, but relating it to real life and making it relevant to where they're at. And then saying, well, okay, we have these codes of conduct, where did they come from? And getting them to really think that these things don't just parachute out of nowhere, I think is really important context. But above all, I think it's really important to give a chance for students to think, to have opinions and to discuss things. And as one student came to see me once about this, and he couldn't understand what do I need to know for the exam type question. And when he asked about the ethics, I realised what he was asking was he didn't really understand that he was allowed to have his own opinion about something from the culture he came from. And that was a really novel concept to him. So I think it's really important to teach these things because we can get students to think and to think outside the box. So if you want to ask me anything else, I'll be open, go over to the other table. Thanks, John.
So that was great. 3 different aspects of teaching ethics. I'm hoping that there's a roving microphone, or maybe people will have to come down to this fixed microphone position here to ask questions. And I'm assuming now these mics are on. I'm going to start the questioning. Ros, you said that your students welcome that course. It was very much something that they, and that's something I think that we found in Exeter, that suddenly a student realised that you didn't have to have the answer of 55,000 or whatever it was, that they could have an own opinion. But Chris and Lynne, do you find that this sort of teaching in undergraduate courses is well received, or is there resistance to it? Chris?
So we certainly have found over the years that it's been well received. Interestingly, I think it does depend how the material is packaged. So going back a bit in time, we did used to take things in terms of what is the... so we would perhaps have a session on genetic modification, we'd have a session on gene therapy, we'd have a session on animal experimentation, and students related very well to that. In the context where in my teaching now, where we have the research topic, we find that actually we're much more instrumental. So we've got to include a lot more of if you're doing a project involving animals, or if you're doing a project involving humans, these are the legislations and the ethical committees that you've got to go through. And that kind of practicalities isn't quite as exciting as the rest of it. But I think overall people do recognise that this is an important aspect of the contemporary research.
So your students realise it adds an impact to their science. Lynne, what about you?
Well, I teach life sciences students, so biomedical through to zoology, And I think it's really important, as Ros said, to empower the students, to give them the rules and the framework and the legislation, and then set a number of scenarios and get them to discuss it and decide whether these studies need ethical permission and what are the costs, what are the benefits. And I think getting them engaged and talking and debating within small groups can really help them understand how important ethics is in the use of both humans and animals in experiments.
And you also raised the topic of having a sound ethical basis helps you very much in an interface with the public, the kind of public-facing scientists.
Yeah, I think public perception in the UK anyway has been quite low in terms of the use of animals in experiments, and it stayed quite low. And I think one of the issues is that the public think that we hide behind closed doors, and it's actually important to say I used X amount of animals in this experiment, but I discovered this new beneficial thing, either beneficial to humans or beneficial, for example, conserving the species in the face of climate change. And I think being open and transparent and actually explaining your work to the public and to students, actually they do then understand why animal use or human use is really necessary.
Mm-hmm. Now, is there a roving mic, or are we going to be using this one down here? Can I have some information on that? Okay, well, if anybody's got a question, please, can they come to this mic? This mic here is on. Oh, is there a rover at the back there? Yeah, excellent. So, questions? I can't see any from here. Questions? Can I ask how many of you up there in the audience actually teach bioethics? None so far. There's a question there, though. Mm-hmm.
Hello. I have a question about kind of what you just were talking about with the impact of science and justifying why you use animals with the impact. Do you have a thought about how that affects basic science? Actually, where it might be harder to justify the benefits for society immediately. So how would using animals in a very basic science context be falling into this?
I think that's for you, Lynne.
Thank you. It's an interesting point. And yeah, of course, when you look at that costs and benefits, if you're studying animals with the view of curing a human disease, it's very easy to say, well, this is going to benefit humans directly. But much of the science we do at SEB, we're really interested in the animal biology for itself. We're not interested in sort of showing a direct human link or benefit. However, humans are really excited about conserving species, conserving animals. They're really excited about maintaining biodiversity, about sustainability of the environment. And it's these sort of key issues. What is going to happen to this species if the climate change? Is it going to shift its distribution, or is it going to persist, or is it going to become extinct? And I think those important questions the public really, really care about. They really care about the environment, and they do really care about animals. And I think that's the way you justify the use of animals when you're specifically interested in the impact of ocean acidification on fish. Obviously, we use fish in many different ways as a foodstuff, but people go diving and they want to see diverse ecosystem, and that's important. So I think that's how you justify it.
Ros, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, just one comment on that. That in my case, teaching truly interdisciplinary students from very different disciplines about animal ethics and human ethics is that we get them, for example, to draw up at different times they have to do a human ethics application because they need to interview someone, or they have to do an animal ethics application and they have to discuss the things that go in that. That really sort of deepens their understanding. So these are people who are not going to, yes, they're going to be scientists, but they're not going to be bioscientists. And I think at least that does, I think if you can be open about discussing these things, like Lynne said, it says, okay, we know there are issues, but we have it all, it is actually under control. And in Australia anyway, all our ethics committees have to have lay people on those committees. So if they're aware of that, then that kind of helps spread that information.
Okay, Chris.
So I'm not sure if this was what the question was getting at, but I think whilst there is an important element of kind of focusing in on pain reduction and sentience, so following through on the arguments that originated from Jeremy Bentham about, can they feel pain? And it's very important that we do include lots of material on that, but the problems that have been discussed relating to that are twofold, really. Some people are arguing that actually, if you over-focus on pain, then concern about the environment more generally perhaps doesn't get carried across. And equally, other people would object in terms of those who would take a high moral view on the status of the embryo, for example, would argue that that's not covering the embryo for protection either. In terms of the environment, I mean, there are two ways of looking at that. There's the notion of so-called dark green ethics, where people are concerned about the environment for its own sake. And then you do see references which are very much more a concern for the environment based on the impact on people, so an anthropocentric type approach. So that's a kind of a more of a light green ethic.
Yeah, thank you. There's a question there. I can see an arm just about. Yeah, far away.
Yeah, okay. The question could be a little bit strange. The issue of ethic is only restricted to the vertebrate, or is this also kind of plant ethic? Or if we do the plant experiments and we also spray for insecticide is there any concern in these cases?
Ros, I'll ask you.
Yeah, I'm a plant biologist. It does make life awful lot easier. At the moment, certainly in my country, insects are not covered by animal ethics legislation, so there's no problem for spraying for pests on your plants. However, we do deal with other ethical issues such as environmental ethics and what we should do with GMOs and those sort of things. So there can be other topics that are relevant to that. One of the other aspects of ethics which we haven't really touched on is that whole thing to do with plagiarism and fraud in science as well. So I think the topic can be quite broad and but there's no problem with spraying things for insects, which is just as well, or none of you would be wearing cotton clothing.
And I think from this, from a plant scientist, the most of the ethical concern would be environmental, about is this particular genetic modification suitable for releasing into the environment without there being any ethical risk. So it will be focused on that rather than on whether plants feel pain. And I know there was a big movement in the kind of post-hippie era of the late 60s and 70s to sort of talk to your plants and play music to them, and if they heard the lawn being mowed, that they would wilt. But I think this is past, thank goodness. Any more questions up there? I can't see any hands. Oh, there's one over there.
Thank you. So, I'm assuming we have these sessions because scientists, even after Nuremberg, sometimes behaves unethically. So in the view of the panel here, what do you think is the most common ethical breach that scientists commit today?
The most common ethical breach?
Yeah. What's the most common way to commit an ethical error or do something wrong?
Mm-hmm. Chris, can I ask you to start that one?
Thank you, John. I'm just shooting from the hip because you just asked the question, and it's not something I've thought about in that framework before. If I think about what is an ethical quandary about which most of my colleagues would say that they've experienced at some stage, I would say probably abuse of the peer review system would be
the peer review system,
so that most people can tell a tale of when they've either had a paper submitted and they have suspicions that the anonymous reviewers have bounced their paper back in order to have time to work on their own work, or abuse privileged information in that way, or others who can talk about having given a guest presentation at a different university and suddenly discovering somebody from there has published in a similar area. So that's the first one that springs to mind.
Ros.
The first one that springs to my mind is photographing students on a field trip and then tweeting it. You know, you shouldn't do that unless you've got written permission from the student to do it.
Lynne, anything for you?
Well, I was just reading in the news today, there's a researcher from UCL who will remain nameless, who has basically been found out for committing fraud and making up data. And I think we are so battered by metrics that can, and I'm not saying it's acceptable at all, but people are prone to try and get published more and more and more because, you know, this drives science and it drives all these assessments and things. So fabrication of data seems to have been highlighted quite a lot recently. It's quite scary.
Yes, I think that I would agree with that fabrication of data and if you like, optimizing data has led to some fairly high-profile losses of employment from the States through Europe, even out to South Korea and now China. So fabrication of data.
If not full-blown fabrication, then being selective with the data.
Being selective with data, yeah. Any more questions? Oh, there's an arm there, look. It's attached to a person as well, I can see now.
So I don't know how long you've been teaching these courses, but over the last decade or so, did you see a change in the incoming students' ideas about ethics and how they feel about questioning things? I think in general, you're pushed to being less critical often, and you have to be very careful not to offend anyone or not to say anything wrong. So did that affect the way your students think when they come into your course, and do you see a change during the course?
So Lynne, would you like to kick off that one?
I find increasingly that students are adopting an animal rights view, and it's become harder and harder to get them to engage with actually thinking about ethics of animal use, because they're adopting animal rights view, which is no use of animals at all. They're refusing to do things like dissections, even when you can justify, you know, the practical itself. They're just refusing to use animals, and that it can be difficult to break into their sphere of thinking if they're just totally closed off to the use of animals. I think the students that are open, you do see them develop and feel that they understand the ethical issues surrounding the field that they're studying. So that's really nice.
Ros, we'll come down the line.
Yeah, so I guess as always, students always like to have things that they can discuss instead of thinking that everything is just, here is the answer, let's learn the answer. So I think that hasn't changed, and if anything, they want to do more of that and have their opinion taken seriously. On the other hand, I think they're much more aware of the legal basis of ethics, and so what I try and guide them to is that there are other bases for ethics other than just, I know Chris will know because he teaches this properly with the proper words, but you know, you can have moral ethics and you can have religious ethics and you can have written legislative ethics, and they're all very different. And so I think I've just noticed that they seem to be a bit more legal, like what is the law on this?
So
yeah, Chris.
We're certainly seeing the same as Lynne. We're seeing undergraduate students being less willing to take part in standard laboratory practicals than they were previously. And that's just in the last 18 months, really. That's come through quite strongly. I don't know whether there is a kind of a national campaign towards that or an international campaign towards that, or whether it's something that just people are picking up just intuitively. There certainly is an element in which people are being misled into believing that there are a standard set of appropriate alternatives, which isn't necessarily the case. And I know of one archive of apparent alternatives that they often point to, but if you go and look, some of the programs were written in Windows Vista and haven't been updated since, so they don't work. So there is certainly an element of that.
Yeah.
I'd just like to,
Ros.
just to quickly add, as a plant biologist, if you have students who don't want to dissect, you just send them down the corridor and say, go and do plant science. Just a plug there.
Or microbiology. Yeah, we've had similar experience at Exeter, that there has been an increasing number of students unwilling to dissect. Yeah. Any more up there? There's one at the back there. Look, you're doing. Oh, there's one there first. Yeah, thank you.
Hi. So I didn't plan for this, but it kind of adds up to that. We've been seeing in lab courses, we do lab courses with fish and insects as well. And we've seen an increasing amount of students who question after they've done the experiment why we do it, because we don't get new data from it, we don't have something we can publish, like why do they do it? What do you answer to such students?
Yeah, I'll ask Lynne to kick that one off, I think.
Obviously, you have to highlight the educational benefits, and you have to say to them, if you're going to treat an animal humanely in the future, you have to have the technical skills to do any procedures on the animals. You have to have that proficiency. At Liverpool, where I'm based, I've set up an ethics committee reviewing all student practicals to actually go through them and say quite clearly what are the benefits of these practicals, so that then the staff and myself can speak to students and say, you are learning real life skills, you can take this into your future career. And so that's really the benefits that we see when we are repeating things that have been done before, that these are very, very important skills to know.
Yeah. Do the other two want to come in on that?
I would just say that actually much the same issues that we mentioned now, it's really important that we do justify why a particular experiment is being done. We can't assume that that's the case. And we certainly don't want to be in a situation, for example, in my own context, I had done 5 or 6 rat dissections while still at school, even before I got to university. That's repeating things unnecessarily. So there's an appropriate intervention at an appropriate time. Just, it does make me think, though, as well, of the fact that there are issues associated with students doing experiments on themselves. So we've often thought that getting students to be the subjects for lab practicals was an alternative to animal experiments, which was relatively ethics-free. But of course, that's not the case, and some of the sorts of physiological tests that my colleagues and I would do can throw up examples of concerning heart traces, for example. And so it would be ethically wrong to ignore that. It would also be ethically wrong to get the rest of the class to gather around and say, come have a look at Fred's heart trace. He's really weird. So we've introduced more ethical guidance in terms of the practicals with the students themselves being the subjects.
Yeah, the same happened at Exeter as well. There was a question somewhere at the back there just now. Has it faded away? Yeah, there it is.
So we've seen that ethics is a big field here, and Ros, I really liked your Venn diagram illustrating that. And so we know that a course has limited time in it. So my question is, do you find it more effective to try to give a really broad range of examples, or to pick kind of a few things like human subjects, fabricating data, familiar examples, and go into depth on them?
Can we take it down the line then, Chris, to start with?
So I think there's a very important role to be played by looking at case studies. So that's something which we try and maximize. So that's either real case studies or gently fictionalized case studies, depending on whether you want to, what aspects you're trying to pick out. But there are issues associated with that as well. So for example, bioscience students are often, their educational expectation is to be talked at for 50 minutes. And so sometimes then inviting them to have discussions, they sometimes don't necessarily see that that's had the same value. No, we didn't learn anything, we only discussed things for an hour. And so it's again important to be explaining the rationale for what we're doing and why.
But you cover quite a broad range. of material. Yeah, Ros?
Yeah, I think the first thing, I mean, you do have to grab people's attention why it's important, but I think you need to give them the intellectual context and the principles that are involved in the ethics, and then that can be illustrated by some specific case studies, which may be popular or not, depending on, they may be fraud or whatever, but they're to illustrate particular points of the intellectual context or the legislative context. And then in our case, we have the students have a workshop where they work in groups of 4, and each in the class, there's 24 people in a class, and each group have a different scenario. So as they work through that, then they present that to each other. So in a sense, they, things like 3-parent families with mitochondrial transport or something on stem cells or various things. And so then they get a few options to explore, to hear briefly from the other students about it. And I think peer-to-peer teaching is something that we could really make more of, because students do get a lot out of hearing other students' evaluation of a particular case study.
Yeah. Lynne, do you want to come in?
Yeah, we also use case studies, and we get the students to sort of role play, because our ethics review boards have lay members, they have the scientist comes and explains. We get them to role play and adopt a specific role and ask the scientist to explain to the lay member what is the benefits of the research, what are the techniques, and that really helps the students to really think through from different perspectives the sort of ethical issues and how to talk to each other and debate with each other, and I think it's quite valuable.
Chris, did you want to come back?
Just to say, a guaranteed way to turn bioscience students off any discussion of ethics is actually to start with the hardcore moral philosophy up front and say, Immanuel Kant said this, Jeremy Bentham said that. Yeah. So to get around that, we start with a case, and I get the students to suggest answers to me, and I group them onto the board in 2 columns, and it's not actually arguments for and arguments against, it's the type of arguments that they've been demonstrating. So did they give me an answer that was based on first principles and pre-held views and duties, or was it an argument that was based on outcomes and consequences? So we start them off with the case, and then we say, actually, well, what you've done, some of you, is to demonstrate that you were starting from first principles, some of you were starting from outcomes.
I do the same. Isn't that interesting? A quick question from me. Do you think that, perhaps it happens already, do graduate students get an ethical induction before they start their research programs in your institutions? Lynne, since you're...
They are told the rules of ethical experimentation on humans and animals, and then they're told to speak with their supervisor, because the supervisor is responsible for any ethics permissions, and then they have to write in their research proposal before they start about the ethics of whatever they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Ros?
Yeah, likewise for us.
So we do have some, but we've actually applied for a grant to do very much more on that than we have previously.
Yeah, at my university, the students get an induction in research and science ethics through the graduate school, and one assumes that individual supervisors, and that is unfortunately an assumption, are dealing with the ethics of their own subjects. Time for another question up there, if there are any. Yeah, look, there's one just here. Keep waving so she can see you.
Hello. I'm a plant scientist, so don't have to deal with like human biology ethics or something like that. But I've gone through a couple of personal ethical questions as to life choices, I'd say. One example being, I thought genetics are very interesting, but I didn't like what companies did with the outcome of science, so I chose not to go down that road. How do you empower students to make their own choices and have their own opinions about things?
Nice. Ros, do you want to kick off with that one?
Well, I think the number one thing is for them to know it's okay to have your own opinion and make choices about this, but that needs to be an informed choice. But just to empower them in that way, that it's okay.
Lynne?
I absolutely agree with Ros. I mean, I talk to students a lot about ethics, and some students who I deal with are dealing with animals. They're on an animal course and they come to see me and say, actually, I don't want to go down this route, I'd like to go and do something else. And we sit and discuss it, but it's their choice and I always respect that.
Yeah. Chris?
Yes, just to agree again, really. I mean, so clearly we want people to making informed opinions, so not to have knee-jerk responses, but at the end of the day, if somebody's uncomfortable with something which the rest of the cohort is comfortable with, then we need to, as best we can, be adapting to that. So certainly in the context of compulsory components of a course, in the first year, where all students take the same program, we would give people opt-outs. Subsequent to that, it becomes slightly more difficult because there's an assumption that if somebody's chosen to do an animal physiology module, then they recognise that there's likely to be animal experimentation of some sort within that. But giving guidance as much as possible.
Great. It's time to wrap up. I'm going to ask each panelist to give one sentence for a take-home message. Just one sentence. Lynne, you're looking eager, so...
Use animals ethically.
Ethics is bigger than this.
Enjoy the drink.
Enjoy the drink. Ethically, of course. Now, just to say that you can continue to think about bioethics on Thursday afternoon at 2:10 and on Friday morning at 9 o'clock. It's listed, for reasons I do not understand, as a careers workshop, but it is about how we get students to think about ethical issues, and it'll be largely case study based, and there'll be quite a lot of opportunity for individual group work and discussion. That will be led mainly by me and Chris. I think Ros is joining in to some extent as well. So that's in the room that's called Barcelona, and that's at 2:10 on Thursday or 9 o'clock on Friday morning, a workshop talking about teasing out the issues in topical case studies. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you to our panelists. And it's time for a drink. Thank you also to our support staff who've been running about and turning things on and off.